Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome to Inside Scoop. I'm Catherine Reed, your host, and joining me tonight is Ben Tribbett, political analyst extraordinaire. You can find him on Twitter at @NotLarrySabato. Thank you so much for joining me, Ben.
Thank you.
This has been an exciting election year. In fact, we decided the last time we met that we were going to do this show the Monday after the inauguration because there is so much to talk about. You've been doing this pretty much all of your adult life. I want to say since you were a teenager, you have been following the elections in Virginia. You know the southwestern part of Virginia. Your family's from there, my family's from there. So why don't we start talking about the races in Southwest Virginia. Explain how you saw it coming down and if there were any surprises and why.
Sure. Well, you know, with this historic pickup in the House of Delegates this year, and the Democrats ended up with a net of 15 seats, we saw 1 seat in Southwest, 2 in the Hampton Roads area, 3 in the Richmond area, and then 9 pickups in Northern Virginia. In Southwest Virginia, it actually was interesting that when you look at the gubernatorial results, it actually became more Republican. It was the one area of the state where Ed Gillespie outperformed Ken Cuccinelli. And in most of those counties, Ed Gillespie not only got a substantial more votes than Ken Cuccinelli, but he also got a much larger percentage of the vote. So where Virginia has really been moving the last 15 years, as you see the eastern part of the state becoming more and more blue Democratic, while the western part of the state becomes more and more red. West of Route 29, the Democrats before this election were down to only 2 seats left. One in downtown Roanoke, which is a Democratic mainstay in Southwest Virginia, and one in the city of Charlottesville where the University of Virginia is. Republicans had actually drawn 4 seats in the House of Delegates in Western Virginia to be safe for Democrats. And we had lost 2 of those 4 they had drawn to be safe for us to make their other seats more safe. One of those 2 we were able to win back in the Blacksburg area. The Republicans had actually gerrymandered a seat that included both Radford and Blacksburg to put all the Democratic voters in that area into 1 seat. And somehow the Democrats had lost it 3 elections in a row, but came back this year with Chris Hurst, who was a local news anchor, who was able to pick it up. That was the only seat Democrats were able to pick up west of Route 29 in this election.
And, you know, and as you mentioned, Radford and Tech are both in that district, but so is Giles County. What about the makeup of the voters who came out this year? Were these different voters who came out than the ones who normally come out in off-year delegate race?
Well, especially in that district, I think a lot of the credit for the Democrats picking that up. And Chris Hurst was a particularly good candidate in that he had good name identification
right.
for being on TV there. But one of the keys was mobilizing these younger voters that don't always show up, especially from on campus at Virginia Tech, at Radford. And Tom Steyer's group, Next Generation,
right.
really put a lot of resources into mobilizing those voters statewide, made a big difference in that particular seat, which again was the only one we picked up west of Route 29.
So what about the Hampton Roads area? So we picked up 1 seat west of 29. That's pretty remarkable when you think west of 29 is a lot of the geography of Virginia. So, but it's a rural-urban situation. You know, I think somebody said to me the other day, fully a third of Virginia's population is in Northern Virginia. Mm-hmm. So when you look at a map and you see the geography, trees and, you know, rocks and hills and rivers don't vote. People do.
That's right. Well, so in Hampton Roads, it was interesting because the #1 targeted race we've had in Hampton Roads the last 3 cycles to pick up for the Democrats has been the 94th district in Newport News. But in the 94th district this year, the Democratic candidate actually dropped out late in the process and had to be replaced at the very last minute by Shelley Simons, who had run last time and was a school board member. As we know how that race ended in a tie.
And that was crazy.
And it was, the whole thing around that was really something we could probably spend the whole hour talking about, every piece around that. But the 2 seats the Democrats were able to pick up were actually 2 that were lower on the list in terms of normal Democratic performance. Both were in Virginia Beach. One of which was Kelly Fowler picking up the seat held by Ron Villanueva.
Yeah.
And that was a seat, again, that had been drawn to include most of the Democratic voters in Virginia Beach. But because of those precincts being heavily Filipino, Ron Villanueva had always overperformed there, done very well. There was a lot of questions in this campaign of when the Democrats put up their first candidate that was from that community, whether that would offset that, and it did dramatically. Kelly was able to run very close to the top of the ticket. There was not a lot of crossover voters as there had been there in the past, and the Democrats typically do carry that district up ballot, so she was able to pick that up. The other pickup was Cheryl Turpin, who you remember there had been a special election down there where she had come very close to winning in the special, and I think that gave her some momentum to go over the top. Both of those will be heavily contested seats, though, in Virginia Beach coming back in 2019.
Right. So with Kelly Fowler, is she the youngest? I'm not sure, but she must be one of the youngest of the freshman class.
I believe she is.
I mean, Virginia's list ended up endorsing all 11 women who won, and we also endorsed and provided financial support to Shelley Simons, who came very close, and to a lot of other women. But looking at these races, I can tell you, as a PAC board member, you're trying to look at so many different factors: how the district has voted before, how the candidate themselves was performing as far as door knocks and fundraising, but there were still so many surprises. Tell us a little bit about what happened in Richmond.
Well, Richmond was one of the craziest areas in this election. Not only did the Democrats pick up 3 seats, but there were 3 others that they came within just a hair of winning. The Richmond area historically has been very Democratic in downtown Richmond and in the African-American parts of Henrico County, and otherwise Democrats have been almost non-factors in the rest of the Richmond area. That changed this year. Henrico County has been slowly improving for the Democrats over the last few cycles, and what you saw is both Henrico County seats in the west end of Henrico both flip. This is a classic example of when you over-redistrict for incumbents. The Republicans actually had too many incumbents, so they had to split up their voters in too many different ways. And when you have a low tide, which we had had the last 3 cycles, they can survive that. But at a high tide, they had drawn it so that none of these incumbents could survive this high tide that came in. So you had both of those seats in Henrico flip, one of which was open, one of which was an incumbent defeat. Then you had a seat in the west end of Richmond that flipped. So that's 3. And there were other seats in the Richmond area that almost flipped. So Richmond really was the big surprise this election. You always expect competitive elections in Northern Virginia, but Richmond was really the biggest surprise of this election.
Well, and I think a lot of people give a lot of credit to the liberal women of Chesterfield County. So, you know, I think after the Women's March last January, Network Nova here in Northern Virginia came together to do a lot of grassroots organizing. The liberal women of Chesterfield County, I think, did the same in Richmond. And they mobilized women who had not necessarily been active before in any kind of organizing, and they really got out the vote. Dawn Adams was a surprise, and in close race. I mean, it wasn't a slam dunk, any of these. They were close. But I think Chesterfield County in their Board of Supervisors race also flipped for the first time since 1961. So to me, that says there is such a dramatic impact when people are truly ignited. There was a wave, a real surge. Your analogy, the tide, is perfect. That's exactly what happened. It was like this gigantic wave. So tell us what happened in Northern Virginia. Where were the surprises there?
Well, the surprise was that the Democrats basically just about ran the board. Only person who survived was Tim Hugo by the narrowest of margins. I think Democrats picked up 9 seats in Northern Virginia. Most people assumed before the election 2 were guaranteed. There were 2 heavily Democratic open seats held by Republicans, one in the 2nd district, one in the 42nd district. And Jennifer Carroll Foy and Kathy Tran picked those 2 up. Then there's 2 other seats which were at the top of everyone's target list, and that was the 32nd district, which was David Reed against Tad Greason, and the 67th district, which was Jim LeMunyon against Carrie Delaney. Both of those districts have voted for the delegate in gubernatorial years that represents the same political party as the governor who carries the district in every election except for 2013, which I think was a unique election because so many people were coming out to vote against Ken Cuccinelli rather than necessarily for Terry McAuliffe.
I think you're right.
Other than that, these districts have voted in gubernatorial years always with the same delegate as the party. So most people felt like those 2 seats were likely to flip if Ralph Northam carried the districts, and there was no question Ralph was going to carry those districts if he won statewide. So they were on the top of the target list. What also came in that same wave in Loudoun County was Wendy Goditis, which was a big surprise in the 10th district. That's historically not one that flips with the governor's party, but it did this election for the first time ever. So that was 5. And then the other 4 pickups were the other 4 seats in Prince William County, all 4 incumbent defeats. So Prince William County went completely blue this year. Danica Rome defeating Bob Marshall, Lee Carter and Manassas defeating Jackson Miller. Hala Alaya, who defeated Rich Anderson, and Elizabeth Guzman, who defeated Scott Lingenfelter. Prince William County is one of those areas, and we'll talk probably more about 2019 later. Prince William County is a very interesting electorate. A few years ago, there was a statistic that came out in Prince William. Over 80% of the senior population, which is the best voters, was white, while their school system was over 80% majority minority, which just tells you, and what Sean Connaughton called that when he was chairman of the board there, was the demographic tidal wave that is coming. And it has started to hit Prince William County in presidential years first. You saw the county become overwhelmingly Democratic. Then you start to see it happening in federal midterms. But these voters were not participating in state elections, especially in state off years, to the same numbers. This year, they came out in a gubernatorial election for the first time and flexed their muscle. They showed they can turn Prince William blue. The question is now in an off-off year, which is the next cycle that comes up in Prince William, where turnout is much lower, and those seniors are much more overrepresented because turnout is lower, whether or not these new delegates can hang on in 2019.
But do you think the fact that we've got candidates that represent more closely the people who live there has something to do with that? I mean, our Democratic candidates in the past have not necessarily represented the people who live in that district. So, looking at whether we can sustain the momentum, are minority voters more likely to vote for somebody who looks like them?
There's different studies that say different things on that. I think that for most of these younger families that are in Prince William County that came out for the first time this year, I think they're looking for the quality of the candidate. And we also had, the reason I don't like that is just because it diminishes the quality that you're saying, like that they were elected not because of the quality of the candidates, and these were high quality candidates.
They were, but they were high quality candidates, like the women who ran. We've always had high quality. Our legislature.
No, we have not always had high quality.
No, but we've had a 400-year legislature. Don't tell me there haven't been women in Virginia who were qualified to hold elected office. The path to get there in both parties,
but they weren't running,
has been difficult. So now we've got, again, going back to Virginia's list, supporting women when they run in primaries is part of the biggest hurdle. If you can't get your candidate, as quality as they are, past the Democratic primary, they never get on the ballot for anyone.
Well, remember the 5 pickups in Prince William, 4 of them were women. One of them was Lee Carter, though. But one was Lee Carter. So it was gender, race, all of those factors didn't play much of a role in how much these candidates won by. The minority candidates didn't win by more than the white candidates. The women didn't win by more than the men. Everybody won. And I think that has a lot to say about that everyone was energized because of President Trump and coming up. Now, the question is, you said, will it help them that they're more reflective of their community? The question is, will the off-year electorate be reflective of the community or not?
Well, and that is a very good question we're going to come back to, because as Ben says, there are so many things that we could talk about involving this election, but we are going to try to cover it all in the amount of time that we have. So please join us after this break when we will be talking with Ben Tribbett about Virginia's elections.
Every time I hear the alarm bell go off in school, I think it's an air raid.
A lot of houses in our neighborhood have been destroyed.
I like to close my ears and sing songs whenever the bombs come close.
I'm worried our new neighbors won't like us.
But I know it's all gonna be worth it.
I just want my family to be safe.
But these are not my words.
These are not my words.
These are not my words.
One day these rats were playing in the woods. Well, it's some matches and that's no good. Yeah. Listen to smoke before you give it a try.
Only you.
Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about ripped off money. Nothing very nice on a homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Yeah.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
How far would you go to protect the planet?
I want you to build an ark.
Here we go. Okay, that's good. Oh, okay. Ow!
Maybe there's another way.
People, the flood is imminent!
Is it too much to ask for a little precipitation?
Go to fightglobalwarming.com to find out what you and your community can do to reduce global warming pollution.
When it comes to saving money,
What?
don't act like a baby.
Oh, it's like they're having their own little meeting. This is so humiliating.
Be the boss.
I'm the boss.
What the?
power nap. You were saying.
And make a budget.
Let's get to work.
Need a little help?
Stacy, read back the notes.
I can't read. What's it say?
Create a personalized savings plan and get other tools and tips.
We can share.
You obviously didn't go to business school.
At feedthepig.org.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me tonight is Ben Tribbett, a well-known political analyst here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Thank you so much for giving us your time and your expertise tonight.
Thank you.
So let's talk about 2019. We've got a huge number of freshmen, and in 2 more years, I mean, they're barely in their seats, and they have to start thinking already about re-election. How do you see that playing out as far as them hanging on to their seats?
Well, 2019 is going to be one of the greatest elections we've ever had in Virginia. A 51-49 House of Delegates and a 21-19 State Senate. Both legislative bodies on the line at once. And what you can't do is analyze these races as solo races. They are all affected by what's on the ballot with them. So we can break that down a little bit. In the Senate, you have 5 districts that Ralph Northam carried by a decent margin that are held by Republicans. The top 2 are Senator Dick Black in Loudoun County and Senator Glenn Sturdivant in Richmond. Now, you remember both of those races were the 2 most targeted races last time. Yes, I do. And both were narrowly won by the Republicans. So the Democrats will be back this year looking for those. I would say for the most part, there aren't a lot of vulnerable Democratic senators that are incumbents on the ballot. So the Senate will likely flip based on one of those 2 seats. There's some others where Democrats can make a play, but it's unlikely they would lose those 2 and win somewhere else the seat. So those 2 are really going to be the keys to retaking the Senate. With Justin Fairfax as the lieutenant governor, Democrats did carry that in November. They only need to pick up 1 seat to make it 2020 and have a Democratic majority in the state Senate. But if they pick up 2, it'll be a 4-year majority. If they pick up 2 seats, if they pick up 1 seat, it'll be 2020 and only a majority for the final 2 years of Justin's term before his seat comes back up in 2021. Then you have these delegates on the ballot. Now, I would say right now the best chance of Democrats winning a legislative body is the state Senate, not the House delegates, even though they're roughly equally situated. And here's why. Democrats are going to be defending a lot of vulnerable seats in the House delegates they picked up in this election and trying to pick up a couple of additional ones where the Senate has a much easier path. Now, you look at these House races, and these House candidates are going to have to run for the first time without a gubernatorial candidate on top of the ticket.
That's true. There's no top of ticket.
Nothing. And I think that there is a little bit of arrogance, I'm not going to use the word of, we'll say hubris, from some of these freshman delegates. I think they believe that they won these elections on their own. They went out, they worked hard, they did lots of good work. They raised money, they worked hard. But they don't understand, having not been through the cycles before, a lot of this was not just them. A lot of this involved Ralph Northam, and Ralph Northam running a good campaign, and people coming to vote for Ralph Northam, and while they were there, they voted for all the other Democrats. That's how top of the ticket works. And in an off-year election, you don't bring out that same electorate. So what it's impacted by oftentimes, and this is something that is always interesting, usually higher turnout in off-year elections is more indicative of the local races that are happening in that district than they are about the state races. People are mostly interested first in federal, second in local, third at state level. And it's because the local races oftentimes are much closer to home, you know the candidates better, and it's issues that you're much more likely to fight about. If your local government is doing something to change the traffic light in front of your house, you're much more fired up about that than necessarily a bill that went through Richmond. Right. So that's what really drives turnout, is these local elections. So in different areas of the state, they have different local cycles of different things that would be on the ballot along with these House races. When you look at Prince William County, one of the reasons there's a Republican Board of Supervisors in Prince William County, which is crazy, is because of the off-year electorate is so much different than the gubernatorial year electorate. And so these Democratic delegates are now going to be running with Republican supervisors. The Republican supervisors are obviously going to do a very good job turning out their vote in 2019. They always have. So the Democratic candidates are going to have to beat not only their Republican opponents in turnout, but the Republican supervisors who are going to be driving turnout. In Fairfax County, you see many more Democratic supervisors. So there's a much better ticket split for most of the people to run with. So the Fairfax County delegates have a better infrastructure in place to win re-election. And then Loudoun County is always crazy. Loudoun County have a Republican board, a Democratic chairwoman, but a Democratic chairwoman who won with, I think, 35 or 36% of the vote because it was a three-way split.
Yeah, it was a split. Yeah, that three-way helped a lot.
Right. So, you know, the environment in Loudoun is, we don't know what that will look like, but Loudoun is obviously very volatile in off-year elections. Prince William's always vulnerable. It's interesting, the 3 seats we picked up in the Richmond area, I actually think the weakest of the 3 was Dawn Adams, who won in the 69th in terms of this campaign. She had the lesser of those 3 campaigns that won. I think she's actually the safest in 2019, and the reason why is both Skylar Van Valkenburg and Deborah Rodman in Henrico County are going to have to run with a Republican state senator on top of the ticket who could drive turnout against them in their delegate races, where in the 68th district, where Dawn Adams won, she's in the west end of Richmond. That's down ballot from Glenn Sturdivant in the most Democratic part of his district, which we know will be a targeted Senate race. Now, if that's a competitive race, which it should be, the Democratic Senate candidate will carry that legislative ticket up ballot, which will help Dawn Adams immensely, because who's going to go vote for a Democratic Senate candidate and cross over for a Republican delegate challenger?
Right.
Very unlikely, right? Whereas in Henrico, you're going to have people coming to vote for a Republican senator, and Skylar and Deborah are going to have to win crossover votes from people voting for a Republican state senator for them, or have to field such a good candidate for state senate that they're winning up ticket in a seat we probably shouldn't be carrying. So it's a very different dynamic for them. Same thing applies in Virginia Beach. The local Republicans in Virginia Beach, especially the state senators, are popular there. So the Democratic delegates are going to have to really fight hard to maintain voters that are up ballot from them in Virginia Beach. Can
you talk a little bit about the effective incumbency? Because you've touched on it a little bit. You've got long-term incumbents, popular Republican senators, and these are going to be, they're only going to have one term of incumbency. You know, how much time does it take before that incumbency really makes a difference, and how well you're hanging on to a seat?
It takes effect over time. I mean, I think that they spent a lot of money in these races, so they're in a better position than most freshmen. However, these senators only run in off-off years. They know the game. And what these new delegates are going to learn is their senators are much more important than they realize, because their senators understand what it's like in an off-off year. They understand the voters of off-off years. These new delegates, it's almost like they're running for the first time in that they've never experienced this. And I'll tell you, Catherine, off-off years are difficult. People are focusing on other things. One of the hardest things about off-off year elections in Virginia is they take place in November of 2019, a month before the Iowa caucuses. Right. You're under a shadow. You're under the national shadow. You're under a shadow of there's nothing on top of the ticket. And you're under a name identification issue. It's hard to run in off-off year elections. And you see that in terms of the pickups. As we said earlier, people like Carrie Delaney or David Reed, the reason those seats always flip in gubernatorial years and they've never flipped in an off-off year is because it's very hard for someone to get traction in an off-off year. Those two incumbents are probably in pretty good position for an off-off year election in 2019. They won't be vulnerable again until 2021. Where other seats like Prince William County, they jump right to the top of the list. And whether you're Danica Rome or Lee Carter or Hala Alala or Elizabeth Guzman, all 4 of those are going to be heavily contested seats in an off-off year in 2019.
Right. So what, as far as when do we need to start thinking about fielding good senatorial candidates for the Senate races? You know, so we've got very popular Republicans who are incumbents. There was a wave. This is going to be a different set of voters going to the polls. So what does the party need to do to start recruiting candidates that we think will have the messaging, the money, the resources, and the message to get out the vote?
Well, in the swing seats, I think there's a limited number of seats, so the party's going to really be focused on that, and the governor's going to play a big role in finding the right candidates for that. I'd point out to you in Prince William County being an example of this. They actually have Democratic senators. I mean, the senators are Jeremy McPike, Scott Somerville. But here's an example. So in southern Prince William County, in Elizabeth Guzman's seat, there are some precincts around, I think it's Lake Montclair. Those are precincts that are heavily Democratic in on-year elections and heavily Republican in off-year elections. Elizabeth Guzman carried those precincts this year, defeating Scott Lingenfelter. Scott Saravel, who shares those same precincts, lost them all in 2015, even though he was barely contested by a candidate that didn't do much of a campaign at all. Those seats, all of the young voters disappear in those seats in off-year elections, and it becomes very, very difficult for Democratic candidates. So it's just a whole different environment, and it's something that you really have to watch out for in an off year, and something that I just think these new delegates don't understand at all.
So let me ask you, we have an email from Chris from McLean wants to know, are Kathleen Murphy and John Faust's race linked in 2019? Do you see a link in those
Absolutely.
two races?
Kathleen has always done very well in governor's year elections. She almost beat Barbara Comstock in 2013, was a strong incumbent, and this year she won overwhelmingly. She struggled in 2015, barely got across the finish line, partly because John Faust was losing the precincts where she overlaps with him. So while John was winning the Drainesville supervisor seat, he was actually winning in Herndon and in South McLean, which are not in Kathleen Murphy's seat. In the northern part of McLean and in Great Falls, he was not as successful, which was not giving her much up-ticket support. So I do think it's linked. I also think that John has faced his toughest challenge. 2015 was a challenge because he had shown some weakness in his 2014 congressional race. I think he's re-solidified his support. I think Kathleen has re-solidified her support. So to this question, I don't think either one of them will be particularly vulnerable in 2019, but the races are absolutely linked, and if one were to lose, both could lose.
What about in Loudoun? Do you see any similar links between the Board of Supervisors and those delegates?
Absolutely. Loudoun County in off-year elections has these tremendous swings back and forth based on local politics, and that always has an impact on the General Assembly races. So there's going to be a lot of impact on that. I don't think we know what that environment's going to look like yet. Phyllis Randall's going to get a tough Republican opposition. I think that she's done a solid job as the chairman.
I think she's impressed people a lot.
But her starting vote total is very, very weak. I mean, she's starting at someone who was in the mid-30s. In a one-on-one election this year, she's got to get to 51. So she's got a long way to go from where she was last time. That having been said, she's been the incumbent 4 years. I don't think she's done anything that would cause people to say we want to toss her. But how that race plays out is going to have a huge impact on the other board races in Loudoun, and those will absolutely have an impact on the General Assembly races because they will drive turnout.
And just one last thing before we go to break. Is there any chance at all that we will ever see the backside of Corey Stewart?
I think we're going to see Corey Stewart lose in a landslide this year, whether he makes it to the general election against Tim Kaine or if he loses in the primary. Either way, I think you're going to see him lose a substantial amount of support from that in Prince William County. And I believe that he will be defeated in 2019 if he even runs. I don't think that Corey Stewart will run in 2019 because I think that he knows he's that politically toxic at this point.
Well, so some good news. When we come back from our break, we're going to talk some more to Ben Tribbett, who has been doing this sort of political analysis for decades now. And he is going to give us some insight, too, about what is going on during our legislative session, which just started. So please join us after the break when we'll plumb the depths a little further about what's going on here in Virginia.
Here, kitty, kitty. Here, kitty, kitty, kitty. Here, kitty, kitty.
You'd think it would be easy to tell which kids have trouble with their eyesight. But that's not always the case. Even though 1 in 4 children may have a vision problem, eye doctors tell us the symptoms aren't always so obvious. We do know that 80% of all childhood learning is visual. And without good vision, kids can have trouble learning to read and may fall behind in school. For clues on how to spot the real-life signs of childhood vision problems and what parents can do, visit checkyearly.com. A public service message from the Vision Council of America, and reading is fundamental.
Oh! Checking your fantasy league?
Nah, just my 401k statement.
Nice. Where'd you find the money for that?
I just been saving a little every month.
I can't seem to save anything.
Well, what about all this? What about the money you're spending?
What money? It's gone before I can get my hands on it.
I got a pizza for a Todd.
Hey, can somebody spot me?
When it comes to financial stability, don't get left behind.
It's 547.
Get tools and tips for saving at feedthepig.org.
report back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Your host, Catherine Reed. Joining me tonight is political pundit Ben Tribbett, who can be found on Twitter at @NotLarrySabato. Thank you so much for giving us your time tonight. Let's delve right into what is happening down in Richmond during our legislative session, which started on January the 10th.
Wow.
Wow. So we've got more Democrats by one in the House. We've got one less. So we're a minority by one vote, 49 to 51. And that's the House and the Senate, right? So it used to be 66 to 34, which seemed like, oh, it's insurmountable. But what does it really mean to be one away when committee assignments are made by the Speaker?
Well, it means a lot. So first, let's just quickly go over the difference between the House and the Senate. The Senate has a tiebreaker. The House does not. So on tie votes in the House, the bills fail. So if it's 50 to 50, it fails. And a tie vote in the Senate, it goes to Lieutenant Governor. So even though both are 2119, 5149 sounds the same, in the Senate you only have to flip one Republican to get it to Justin Fairfax to cast a tie-breaking vote, where in the House you need two Republicans to get it off of the floor. I think the Democrats really mishandled this whole situation badly, starting on election night. Now, I was actually, as the results were coming in on election night, I was down on doing the NBC show in Richmond. We were doing a live election night show, and people were just stunned at what was happening in the House of Delegates. And I said, I want to be the person here who says, even though it looks like right now Democrats were ahead in 52 seats, the Democrats aren't prepared to take a majority here. They're not organized enough to take a majority, and it's going to be a big problem if they do win a majority because David Toscano is not prepared for this. And I think that that got a lot of negative comments from people on social media saying, no, it'll be fine. I think the last few weeks really bore that out. What you saw is David completely missed the opportunity to make a deal with the Republicans when the results of the election were not yet clear of what was going to happen. That was the moment where you could make a deal. You can't make a deal for more power after you know you've lost, when you only have 49 seats. You can't wait until after the coin flip from Shelley. There was a moment in time where Democrats really had a legitimate chance to be at 50 or maybe 51 and could have entered into a long-term power sharing agreement with the Republicans. Now, people have said, why would David do that if he thought there was any chance of getting to 51 and having a majority? Why would he power share with them? They're terrible. They've done all these bad things. Here's why. The Senate is Republican. So if you had a Democratic Senate and a Democratic governor, it would be well worth the risk to go all in to try to take a Democratic House because you could enact legislation on your own. But taking a Democratic House doesn't mean anything if you have a Republican Senate. So you're going to have power sharing anyway. You also know that you have a lot of vulnerable incumbents that are going to come up in 2 years. So entering into a long-term power share, even if the Democrats were at 51, is probably a net benefit to the Democrats long-term. The only way you're going to enter into that deal is striking that deal at a moment in which you have leverage. But they did not want to take the opportunity to have leverage. They wanted to pursue all these avenues that slowly went against us. And look, a drawing is a drawing. There's no way to know what was going to happen in that drawing. Now, I happen to think that recount was done perfectly. I know there were a lot of issues with people who had the recount. I think it was done perfectly. I say that because I've been through these recounts before, and I know how hard every ballot is, and those judges did a tremendous job. Now, I understand that the House Democratic Caucus didn't like the results, and I think for Shelley, I can't even imagine what it's like to go through what she went through and be down 10, up 1, tied. Right. Unbelievable. But they made these judges out to be Republican judges. Actually, the lead judge on this from Newport News has a donor history from before he became a judge that is 100% to Democrats. Okay, he's actually a well-known Democrat in the community there that was supported by the entire legislative Black Caucus, which has a majority of the seats from Newport News. So this idea that it was Republican judges that did this was just complete horse.
Yeah. Okay. I see. I get where you're going with that.
Yeah, and that was how the Democrats really played this out, was spreading these kind of things that were just not right about what was happening. It was really frustrating to watch because I think that rather than doing that, if David Toscano had gone and met with the Republican leadership and said, look, can we have a long-term power share? I think it could have worked. The Senate had a power share that lasted 6 years, from 1997 to 2003. there's absolutely no reason the House of Delegates couldn't have entered into a long-term power share and make it not about one election off here and there, but about having both parties work together and setting the right tone for session. In missing that opportunity, David then missed the opportunity to have any leverage on what the Republicans offered. So then the end offer was essentially a PR deal. They agreed to keep proportional representation, helps them PR-wise, except on the Rules Committee, which is where they're now sending a number of key bills, which are overwhelmingly stacked to Republicans. They're going to kill those bills there. And I don't know what the Democrats got out of this. I think they really missed an opportunity. And what you saw was they just at 34 were not prepared for the possibility of going to 51, and they showed it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it surprised everybody, and we weren't very prepared. But hearing you talk about this strategy makes me think that you are an excellent poker player, right? So I hear you talking about the things and the points at which you have decisions to make. And you can go down this road or go down this one, but you can't always tell how the cards are going to be dealt. And I hear in you talking about this, they should have played the hands they had. They should have played the cards they knew they had better when they didn't know what else they were going to draw.
Poker is such a good analogy. Because
that's what I hear when you talk about this.
Well, because in poker, what you have is pot odds, right? You don't. Whether or not you have the best chance to win the hand is not how you determine how you bet. It's what the total pot is. You know, if you think you probably are going to lose the hand, and I bet $100, but the pot has $10,000 in it, it's worth $100 to throw in the pot to go for the pot, even though you probably don't have the best hand. Where if the pot had $5 in it, you wouldn't want to throw $100 in if you didn't think you had the best hand. That's what's called pot odds, and that's exactly what was going on here. The Republicans were on draws for straights or flushes, using your poker analogy.
Right.
And what the Democrats waited to make the deal was after they caught the flush. They already had the cards. They knew they had the winning hand. They had the nut hand. So then what are you going to do at that point? No one's going to fold their hand when they've got their ace-high flush, and that's the best hand on the table. So the moment in which you could make the deal was when before they got the flush. They had a shot at the flush, but we didn't know they had it. That was before the coin flip. That was when Tim Hugo was still in a tough race. That was when we didn't know what was going to happen in Fredericksburg. The Democrats could have made a deal at that point. They chose not to.
Yeah, I mean, it's, hindsight's always 20/20, but I kind of agree with you that it probably greater consideration should have been given to a long-term strategy. So tell us what happens in the 28th district. Is there a chance for a special election there at all? Do you see that happening? And if there was, when would it be?
There's not. And I mean, Catherine, these are so tough because you look at whether it's Shelley in Newport News or Josh Cole in Fredericksburg, they got completely abandoned by the party. No one supported them, and they almost won. And coming up that close for someone like Josh Cole, and as a first-time candidate, and then finding out that there were these voting errors, my heart goes out to him of like, I can't imagine as a candidate putting that much work in and then having an election end in that way. That having been said, I did an analysis for this for Blue Virginia. There's no scenario in which Josh Cole won this election. That's why the judges are not going to overturn it. He's down, I think it's 73 votes. There's about 140 that are outstanding. But remember that 61 of those votes, of the 140 that were messed up, were actually votes from the 88th district that were mistakenly cast in the 28th, while the rest of the ballots were people that should have been in the 28th that cast ballots outside the district. Those voters in the 88th are from Fredericksburg City, heavily Democratic. So Josh actually gained from that. That keeps him closer than he would have been otherwise. He probably picked up 15 to 20 votes from those 61 net that cast votes in his district that shouldn't have been allowed to. So really he's down more like in the low 80s with about 80 ballots left. The judge isn't going to overturn that. Bob Thomas, and Josh, what a horrible situation for candidates to have to go through in this. I also think it's hard for a judge to overturn this because there was a bill to fix it and the governor vetoed it. Okay, most people don't realize this in 2015. Now, the reason the governor vetoed that bill was he took what I would call a very principled stand. It was a wrong stand, but it was very principled, that he was not going to allow any mid-decade redistrictings because he thought it was bad for the state to have mid-decade redistrictings. That having been said, these types of corrections are always things that happen after redistrictings because when the General Assembly draws their lines, then the local governments have to draw their lines and the precincts get messed up. You have to do some slight adjustments at the boundaries because everyone is doing your other adjustments after the General Assembly does theirs. So when the governor said he wouldn't sign any mid-decade redistrictings, he included that into these adjustment bills. He should have signed the adjustment bill because then these errors wouldn't have been happening. My understanding is this was happening all all over the state. It wasn't just this district. It's just that this one was so competitive.
Yeah,
and that's not right, and it's not fair.
Because I saw something in the Roanoke Times about them looking at HD 17, Chris Head. Now, he won by like 5,600 votes or something. It wasn't even close. But they're saying now they're looking at the fact exactly what you're talking about, that these adjustments were made, but it just didn't flow all the way down to these actual polling places.
And remember, local governments generally draw their lines. So this is getting into the technical side. But in redistricting, what happens is a legislative body can first determine the margin of, what we'll call margin of error, to the population. The idea of redistricting is everyone has the same population.
Right.
The definition of same population is left up by the Supreme Court, because you can't get everyone with an identical one-to-one population necessarily. So some places will say 1% deviation, some will allow 2% deviation, some will allow 5% deviation. Democrats generally push for a higher deviation. The reason Democrats push for a higher deviation is that what it allows you to do is create districts of influence, particularly for minority voters, in areas where there's not enough minority voters to get to a district of influence without a slight deviation from the numbers. That's why Democrats want that. Republicans generally want the smallest possible deviation. Obviously, Republicans were in control of this process in Richmond, so they had 1% deviations. When you have a lower deviation, it means you have to split more precincts, because there's not precincts that add up to exactly the right total you want to get to. So the Republicans split a lot more census blocks than the Democrats do. At the local level, general boards of supervisors and city councils tend to have higher rates of deviation. They have to split less precincts. But when they do need to split a precinct, so then you have a Senate split, a congressional split, a House delegate split, and a local government split. Those don't always align exactly, and then you have to readjust your precinct boundaries. That's where these types of errors come in on the edges of balancing all of that and getting people in the right precinct to the right place to vote with the right ballot.
Right, and so I think when I spoke to Brian Cannon last time he was on the show, he said there are 224 split precincts, but some of those are split 2 ways and some of them are split 3 ways, and I think some of this issue in Fredericksburg were around 3-way split precincts. So, I mean, it's just complication on complication when people show up and people are looking at the poll books trying to find out which ballot you should be handed.
Right, and it's complicated for the election officials too. I mean, the cleanest election is when you have a precinct that has a local elected official, a senator, and a delegate, and they have one ballot at that precinct. That's your end goal. That's what you want it to look like.
And you have just described Fairfax City. Fairfax City. Chat Peterson, David Boulevard, everything is really contained, and we're very happy with that.
And you don't have any problems.
That's right. We have no problems. Fairfax City is pretty well run, actually. Join us after this break. We're going to come back for the final segment of Inside Scoop with Ben Tribbett talking about what is happening in Virginia politically.
You made your house a reality. Homeschooling yourself on loans, color-coding listings, and flushing every toilet in a 20-mile radius. If you can ace house hunting, you can do it for retirement. Get on track with tips at aceyourretirement.org.
Here's to the things that can keep us safe. Those we use all the time with hardly a thought. Those that are silently standing by to save our lives. And now, those that we carry with us everywhere we go. Many mobile devices will now bring you wireless emergency alerts, real-time information directly from local sources you know and trust. With the unique sound and vibration, you'll be in the know.
Listen, I realize that I'm not perfect, but it all really started to change because you judge me for having a problem. No one is going to know that I need help. I need help. I know that no one is going to judge me for having a problem. I realize that I'm not perfect, but it all really started to change because you listen.
Family. Whether it's a short trip or a long haul.
Estimated time, 47 hours.
They will beg.
You're hungry? I'm happy to provide.
They will plead.
Deep fried butter on a stick.
But whatever you do, don't wimp out.
Now you're talking.
Make them buckle up.
He can't hurt.
Remember, safety first. Cheese curls second.
Are you
orange?
Your house a reality.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. We're talking to Ben Tribbett here tonight about what is happening post-election, post-inauguration, and now that we are into the legislative session here in Richmond. So tell me, Ben, how do you see, after today's demise of some very high-profile gun bills in the Senate, how do you think this portends for the rest of the legislative session? I mean, are we basically seeing what we expect to see over and over and over again on some of these bills?
Look, I mean, you're seeing the bases move apart. The Republicans are reacting to their base. They're not just going to vote through all this Democratic legislation because we had a large pickup in the House of Delegates this year. If they want to preserve their majorities, they have to turn out their voters. And their voters don't want more gun control. Their voters don't want a tax increase. Their voters don't really want anything that the Democrats are pushing right now. And so getting Republican votes is not going to be just as easy as going in and banging on the table and saying, we did well in this election, come join us. And you've seen that in the Senate today. The party line votes were killing a lot of important gun legislation. I saw one that made it out its way to another committee at least, which was the banning of bump stocks. I was interested to see Senator Saslaw ask Philip Van Cleve from the VACDL, Citizens Defense League, what the purpose of them was, and he said they're fun to shoot, which I think was a horrible thing to say when you have Virginia victims of the Las Vegas shooting who were there to testify about what they saw from these things. I mean, it's so dangerous. But the Republicans' base really doesn't want these bills. And the Republicans are having to decide, you know, how much do they want to lead from the middle and how much they want to lead from the right. And so far they're picking they want to lead from the right.
You know, and so all of this, you know, proportional committee assignments. So now it's going to be 10 Democrats and it's 12 Republicans. But if the Republicans are going to vote in the committee, which is where the legislation lives or dies, you know, we're all focused on the floor speeches and the floor votes, but, you know, thousands of bills will be killed in committee. So you actually have to look at how the committee members are voting. So it doesn't really matter whether it's defeated by 1 vote or 5 votes. If it's defeated, it's defeated. So are we really going to see that even though there is more proportional distribution of seats in the committees, that in fact the Republicans will still continue to vote along party lines?
I think that you're seeing what's left of the Republican Party in the House of Delegates, and obviously they suffered some substantial losses. The moderates are the ones who lost. And not all the losers were moderates, but they were on the more moderate side of the House. What's left is some very conservative delegates. There are not a lot of moderates left in the House. So who are you going to get to flip on these votes? You're not going to get a delegate from Southwest Virginia to vote for more gun control who's a Republican, for example.
Right.
The Republicans also pick who's on those committees. So when the Speaker of the House selects which Republicans are on those committees, he's able to pick the hardest line Republicans who are going to be the least vulnerable from casting those votes. So he wouldn't put on a suburban Republican from Chesterfield or from Virginia Beach on a committee where they'd have to cast votes against their constituents regularly. Meanwhile, when he puts Democrats on committees, you'll notice a lot of the vulnerable Democrats have ended up places like the Finance Committee. Why? The Finance Committee votes for tax increases. They're trying to get the Democrats on record as many times as possible in vulnerable seats for voting for tax increases. So this is a power that in Virginia, the Speaker of the House has for both committee assignments. Now, David Toscano negotiated having input, but it didn't look like a lot of his input was taken. I also noticed that David ended up with some very choice committee assignments himself, so I'm not sure if his input was to ask for the committee assignments for himself, but that's the end game of what happened. So I think that when you see how this session is going to play out, you're going to see it be very disappointing for Democrats who are expecting big things from the legislature. And I think that the governor's office, you know, they don't want to interfere in legislative affairs, but I think that the governor's office is going to have to be the leader of any successes we have because he is the one point of leverage that we do have.
So all the grassroots advocacy, all the liberal women of Chesterfield County and the Network Nova, I know a lot of these groups are now turning their sights on specific bills. You know, I'm interested in bills on child care regulation and paid family leave and community schools. So these are newbies. Again, they were new to political campaign organizing. They're new to legislative advocacy organizing. And it's really about figuring out who the constituents of the Republican members are, which is going to be kind of hard for Democrats to figure out how to reach constituents in some of these Republican districts, because the pressure needs to be applied during the committee hearings.
From their districts.
From their districts.
Yeah. And the Democrats have never really done well with that when you look historically in the General Assembly, since in the modern era, since we've become what I would call a Northern Virginia-centric party. We have great rallies in Arlington and Alexandria where we get fired up about what they're doing to the state, but we don't always take that message out further. I think that this election year we did a better job going Northern Virginia wide, but now these districts are downstate. And so do we have good spokesmen in the Southwest to go into those districts and help mobilize people in Roanoke or in Franklin County or in the Martinsville area? And the answer right now is we don't. And the party has really abandoned those areas in terms of competitive legislative seats. Statewide candidates still care about them, but our legislative candidates don't get support that run from there. And so we don't build an infrastructure that causes the Republicans to have any concern at all about, if they vote this way, what it'll lead to. And you think about, like in Southside Virginia, for example, Martinsville and Danville have been historically Democratic cities. They have historically had Democratic delegates. We've given up on those areas so much that we're not even supporting the candidates who run there anymore. And part of the problem with that strategy is that even if they're going to be unsuccessful, if the districts have moved away from us too much to win, even putting a competitive race on the board there is vital to those Republican delegates hearing footsteps and maybe casting a vote here and there for their constituents. But you let them win with 60, 65% of the vote, they're going to look at it and say, why would I vote for that?
So, and to explain a little bit, too, about the importance of who sponsors these bills. So, Sam Rasool is sponsoring HB 121 about establishing a task force under the Virginia Department of Education about setting up community schools here in Virginia. We don't have any community schools here in Virginia. Sam is in a part of the state that would benefit from schools that provide wraparound services to students who need them. But he's a Democrat. You know, I've talked to Ken Plum before about carrying legislation. Ken has said to me, Catherine, if you want that piece of legislation, you need to find a Republican to be the sponsor of it. Do people understand that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think what Ken's saying is basically right. Although I will say there are some Democrats that actually are very progressive but have done a good job of being able to pass their legislation because they come with a little bit more limited of an ask and something that the Republicans can work with, rather than coming in with big asks that they know the Republicans will just kill outright. I think part of it is also behavioral. There's a lot of, in Richmond, individuals and their behaviors really matter. I'll give you an example. There was a delegate this last session coming off the floor, and the 13-year-old pages were coming on the floor delivering pizza, and the delegate ran into the pages and knocked them over and knocked pizza all over the place, and then told the pages to pick it up and continued on his way. And all the other delegates saw that. That delegate has not passed a bill since then, okay? Because all the other delegates on their side and on the other side saw it, and they don't like that delegate anymore. Like they you know, they
like, don't be a jerk.
Right, exactly. And that kind of thing really matters. People don't realize how much that matters. In Congress, that doesn't matter. No one gets to know each other well enough. They go on the floor to vote, they leave the floor. In Richmond, you go on the floor for the full day, you spend a lot of time together. And just being able to understand those issues, if you have a delegate from Fairfax County who takes some time to learn about the issues in Roanoke and go meet with the Roanoke Republicans from that area to help them with some legislation, give some of the things they're doing bipartisan support, you can get them on board with your legislation. But you got to take the time to build those relationships. And a lot of the delegates that we send from Northern Virginia don't always do that. They just sort of lecture downstate. And you know, you're from Southwest Virginia, you understand this. It's a different political culture there. The Democrats and Republicans in those districts are not enemies, they're friends. They're neighbors. It's a whole different political culture than it is in Northern Virginia, where no one knows their opponents and no one really knows their neighbors that well. And so if you want to work with them, you have to do things that benefit their districts. And you know, what you see with the new Democratic delegates, we had the new Democratic delegates from Fairfax County run on changing the state funding formula to get Fairfax County more money. That's going to cut money from Southwest Virginia schools. Believe me, the Republican delegates know this. Our new delegate from Southwest Virginia, Chris Hurst, he called in his campaign, I actually talked about this on Twitter, you'll be amazed by this. No one noticed this up here, but he actually called in his campaign to completely defund Arlington and Fairfax County public schools from the state, and said because they have plenty of money.
But you're highlighting, it's a matter of understanding.
It's a matter of understanding.
Chris doesn't live up here. We don't, I went to school in Southwest Virginia. One of the things I tell people about Donors Choose, which is, and I support, and I have for 5 years supported projects through donorschoose.org, but I always select projects in rural schools in Virginia, Southwest Virginia, South Side, but I always look for places I've never heard of, in counties I've never heard of, because to me, my dollars need to go into Virginia schools where they don't have any other resources. But not everybody thinks that way.
Well, and I'll give you an example. Carrie Delaney, new delegate from up here, has a bill in for more recess. That's one of the first bills she introduced. When she goes to present that bill in committee, and this sounds great in Fairfax County, there's studies that say recess is good, yada, yada. I don't have kids, so I don't understand it. But I understand that there are studies that say that. The rural delegates are going to say most of our school districts can't afford playgrounds. So recess is very different to us than it is where you're from. Why don't you work with us before you start talking about mandatory additional recess out of the classroom to get funding enough for our schools so we can have a playground?
Right.
And that's the disconnect.
And that is relationships. And I've had so many people on this show from nonprofits where I have really stressed you have to build relationships with elected officials. I mean, they have relationships with each other, but year after year, I don't expect bills that get introduced for first year or the second year are going to pass. There are bills like the Earned Income Tax Credit. It took 10 years to get that passed. That is a lot of relationship building. So it's a marathon, not a sprint, and people should not be disappointed when they don't get it the first time. You have to go back and have another conversation, have more dialogue, and listen. You really have to, everybody has to listen better, I think.
Right. And the reality is that one of the oppositions to more recess in the past in the state has been, you go into the mountain regions, it's a lot tougher to send kids outside and for a long part of the year than it is in the eastern part of the state, which is historically, more seasonal.
True,
it's a different situation, and different school districts handle differently.
And they're also looking, some of these schools, at feeding their kids breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I funded a project down in Galax for an elementary school where they feed them breakfast, lunch, and an afternoon meal.
Yeah.
When those schools are dealing with that kind of problem, more recess really isn't at the top of their priority list.
And it's very well intentioned, but it's a good example of when you go down from Northern Virginia and that's what you lead with, people feel like you don't understand the statewide problems, and it makes you a less effective delegate.
Well, thank you so much. You've been a great guest. He has been a great guest, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here. I sincerely hope that everybody has a better understanding of what happened in this election, what's happening right now through March 10th down in Richmond. It is our legislative session. Get involved. Find out how your government works, because you make the difference in good public policy here in Virginia.